In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and overnight, Cuba lost 85% of its trade. The island nation, which had been propped up by Soviet subsidies for decades, was suddenly cut off from the world. Fuel, food, medicine, and all the basic necessities of modern life vanished. This was the beginning of the special period in a time of peace, a decade-long crisis that pushed the Cuban people to the absolute brink of survival. This wasn't a war. There were no bombs or invading armies. This was a silent, slow-motion collapse of a society, a famine that unfolded not in a rural, undeveloped country, but in a modern, urbanized nation. The average Cuban lost 20 pounds. Adults had an average daily protein intake of just 15 to 20 grams, far below the recommended 50-60 grams. The government's ration book, the libreta, became a cruel joke, offering only a handful of rice and beans for a month. The people were on their own. How do you make a steak out of a grapefruit? How do you turn banana peels into a source of protein? How do you make coffee without coffee beans? These weren't culinary experiments. They were desperate acts of invention, born out of necessity and a fierce will to survive. The Cuban people, in their darkest hour, became the masters of culinary alchemy, turning the inedible into the edible, the worthless into the priceless. Today, we are breaking down the 10 most ingenious and desperate meals that Cuban families ate to survive the 1990s collapse. Survival isn't theory, it's history. This is the prepper age. Number 1. Grapefruit steak. When the butcher shops were empty and the memory of beef was a distant dream, the Cuban people turned to an unlikely source for a steak dinner, the grapefruit. This wasn't a simple substitution. It was a feat of culinary engineering, a testament to the power of human ingenuity in the face of starvation. The process began with a grapefruit, a fruit that was still relatively abundant on the island thanks to the tropical climate. The thick, bitter peel was carefully removed with a sharp knife, and the fruit was cut into thick, steak-like slices, approximately ½ an inch thick. The slices were then boiled in water for 30 to 45 minutes, a crucial step that served two purposes. First, it softened the tough, fibrous texture of the fruit. Second, it helped to leach out some of the bitterness of the grapefruit, which could be overwhelming. After boiling, the grapefruit slices were carefully removed from the water and pressed between clean cloths to remove excess liquid. They were then marinated in a mixture of whatever seasonings were available. A typical marinade might include minced garlic, diced onions, and a splash of sour orange juice, all of which were still grown in backyard gardens. The goal was to infuse the bland, boiled grapefruit with as much flavor as possible to mimic the savory taste of a real steak. The final step was to fry the marinated grapefruit slices in a hot pan with a little bit of oil, if any could be found. The grapefruit was fried until it was golden brown and slightly crispy on the outside. The result was a steak that had a surprisingly meaty texture, with a tangy, citrusy flavor that was masked by the marinade. It was a far cry from a real steak, but it was a source of calories and a welcome change from the monotony of rice and beans. Number 2. Minced banana peels. In a world where nothing could be wasted, even the peels of bananas became a source of food. The banana peel, which is normally discarded as inedible, was transformed into a substitute for minced meat, a staple of Cuban cuisine that had disappeared from the dinner table. The process began with the peels of green plantains, which were tougher and less sweet than the peels of ripe bananas. The plantain peels were preferred because they had a more substantial texture. The peels were first thoroughly washed, then boiled in water for 20 to 30 minutes to soften them and remove natural bitterness. After boiling, the peels were scraped with a knife to remove the tough outer layer, leaving behind the softer, more pliable inner peel. The inner peels were then finely chopped or ground using whatever tools were available. The goal was to create a substance that had a texture similar to minced meat. This minced meat was then seasoned with whatever spices were available. Garlic, onions, and a little bit of cumin were common additions. The seasoned banana peels were then cooked in a pan, often with a little bit of tomato sauce, if it could be found. The result was a dish that looked and felt surprisingly like picadillo, the traditional Cuban minced meat dish. The banana peels had absorbed the flavors of the sofrito and the tomato sauce, creating a savory, satisfying dish. The taste was not the same as real meat, but when properly seasoned and cooked, they were a palatable substitute. The dish was often served with rice, which was still available through the ration system, although in limited quantities. Number 3. Mop steak. This is perhaps the most infamous and stomach-churning of all the special period inventions. The bistec de frazada de piso, or mop steak, was a dish that pushed the boundaries of what could be considered food. It was a product of extreme desperation, a sign that the Cuban people were willing to eat almost anything to survive. The steak was made from the cloth strips of a new, unused mop head. The mop had to be new and unused to avoid contamination from cleaning chemicals. The cloth strips were cut into steak-like shapes, then boiled for several hours to soften them and remove any chemicals, dyes, or sizing agents. After boiling, the cloth was thoroughly rinsed and pounded with a meat tenderizer to break down the fibers. The cloth was then marinated in a mixture of garlic, onions, and sour orange juice, just like the grapefruit steak. The marinade was essential to give the cloth any flavor at all, as it was completely tasteless on its own. The final step was to fry the marinated cloth in a pan until it was crispy on the outside. The result was a steak that had a chewy, fibrous texture with a flavor that was mostly derived from the marinade. The mop steak is a powerful symbol of the depths of the special period crisis. It is a reminder that when people are hungry enough, they will eat things that would be unthinkable in normal times. The mop steak became a legend of the special period, a story that was told and retold as a symbol of the extreme measures that people took to survive. Number 4. Coffee with CHICHAROS. For Cubans, coffee is more than just a beverage. It is a way of life. The morning cup of strong, sweet coffee is a cherished ritual, a source of comfort, and a symbol of Cuban identity. So when coffee became scarce during the special period, it was a major blow to the national psyche. But the Cuban people found a way to stretch their meager coffee rations. The solution was to mix the coffee with chicharos, or split peas. The split peas were first roasted in a dry pan until they were dark brown and had a slightly bitter, coffee-like flavor. This roasting process was crucial as it transformed the bland, starchy taste of the split peas into something that could pass for coffee. The roasted split peas were then ground using whatever tools were available. The ground chicharos were then mixed with the ground coffee. The ratio of coffee to chicharos varied depending on how much coffee a family had. In the early days of the special period, the mixture might be 50% coffee and 50% chicharos. As the crisis deepened, the percentage of chicharos increased until some people were drinking a beverage that was almost entirely made of roasted split peas. The taste of the chicharo coffee was not the same as real coffee. It had a nutty, slightly bitter flavor, and it lacked the rich aroma and caffeine kick of pure coffee. But it was a hot, dark beverage that could be sweetened with sugar, and it provided a semblance of the morning coffee ritual. It was a way to hold on to a piece of normal life in a world that was anything but normal. Number 5. Spaghetti rice. Rice is the cornerstone of Cuban cuisine, the foundation of almost every meal. So when rice became scarce during the special period, it was a culinary crisis of the highest order. But the Cuban people found a way to resolve her. They created a substitute for rice out of spaghetti. The process was simple but tedious. The long strands of spaghetti were broken into small, rice-sized pieces using a knife or by hand. This was a time-consuming process, as each strand had to be carefully broken into uniform pieces. The tiny pieces of pasta were then cooked in the same way as rice. They were boiled in water with a little bit of salt until they were tender, usually about 10 to 15 minutes. The result was a dish that looked and felt surprisingly like rice. It could be served as a side dish, or it could be mixed with beans to create a version of the classic Cuban dish, moros y cristianos. The taste of the spaghetti rice was different from real rice. It had a softer, more pasta-like texture, and it lacked the subtle, nutty flavor of rice. But it was a source of carbohydrates and a way to fill the empty space on the plate. The spaghetti rice became a staple of the special period, a dish that was served in homes across the island as a substitute for the rice that was no longer available. Number 6. Sweet potato bread. Bread is another staple of the Cuban diet, but wheat flour was a luxury that few could afford during the special period. So the Cuban people turned to a native root vegetable to make their daily bread, the sweet potato. The sweet potato, or boniato, is a starchy, slightly sweet vegetable that is easy to grow in the tropical climate and was still relatively abundant during the crisis. The process of making sweet potato bread was simple, but required patience. The sweet potatoes were first boiled until they were soft, then peeled and mashed into a smooth paste. The mashed sweet potatoes were then mixed with a small amount of flour, if any was available. If there was no flour, the mashed sweet potatoes were mixed with a little bit of water and salt to form a dough. The dough was then shaped into loaves and baked in a hot oven, if one was available. Many families had to resort to baking the bread in makeshift ovens, such as large pots with tight-fitting lids. The result was a dense, moist bread with a slightly sweet flavor. It was not the light, airy bread that Cubans were used to, but it was a source of calories and a way to satisfy the craving for bread. The sweet potato bread became a popular substitute during the special period, and it continues to be made today as a healthier alternative to traditional bread. Number 7. Plantain peel. Picadillo. Picadillo, a savory dish of ground meat, is a beloved staple in Cuban cuisine. But with meat being a rare luxury during the special period, a creative substitute was needed. The answer was found in the humble plantain peel. This discarded part of the fruit was transformed into a surprisingly convincing imitation of picadillo. The process began with the peels of green plantains, which were tough and starchy. The peels were first thoroughly washed and then boiled until they were tender, usually about 30 to 45 minutes. After boiling, the peels were drained and allowed to cool, then finely chopped or ground to mimic the texture of ground meat. The resulting picadillo was then sautéed with a sofrito of onions, garlic, and peppers if available. The sofrito was the key to making the plantain peel picadillo taste like the real thing. The plantain peels absorbed the flavors of the sofrito, creating a dish that was both savory and satisfying. Some families would add tomato sauce if it was available to give the dish a richer flavor and a more authentic color. This ingenious use of plantain peels is a powerful example of the Cuban philosophy of no se bota nada, nothing is thrown away. In a time of extreme scarcity, every part of every food item was utilized. Number 8. Condom pizza. This recipe falls more into the realm of urban legend than culinary reality, but during the special period years, anything seemed possible. As the story goes, some pizza makers, faced with the complete absence of mozzarella cheese, used condoms to mimic melted cheese on pizza. The condoms would be stretched over the pizza and heated until they became soft and stretchy, resembling melted cheese. While this story is likely more myth than reality, it represents the extreme desperation of the time and the lengths to which people were willing to go to create a semblance of normal food. The fact that such a story could even be conceived speaks to the severity of the food crisis. Number 9. Potato flan. One of the few success stories of the special period was the invention of potato flan. This dessert, made from potatoes, sugar, and eggs, was created out of necessity, but became so popular that it is still made today. The process was simple. Potatoes were boiled and mashed, then mixed with sugar and eggs to create a custard-like mixture. The mixture was then baked until it was set, creating a dessert that had the texture of traditional flan, but with a unique, slightly savory flavor. The potato flan was a hit because it satisfied the Cuban sweet tooth while using ingredients that were still relatively available. The potato flan became a symbol of Cuban ingenuity and adaptability, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is still room for sweetness. Number 10. Sugar water. When all else failed, there was always sugar water. This was the most basic of all the special period meals, a simple mixture of sugar and water that provided a quick burst of energy. It was not a meal in any real sense of the word, but it was a way to keep going when there was nothing else to eat. As Irina Pino, a survivor of the special period, wrote, "I would leave my house at 8:30 in the morning with a pathetic excuse for a breakfast in my stomach, a bread roll and a glass of sugared water. Milk was a luxury at the time." This simple drink is a stark reminder of the reality of the special period. It is a testament to the fact that for many Cubans, survival was a day-to-day struggle, a constant search for the calories needed to stay alive. As one survivor noted, "It's no accident we have been christened as the kings of invention." This spirit of invention, born out of desperation, allowed the Cuban people to survive one of the most difficult periods in their history. These 10 foods were not meals, they were acts of defiance against starvation. They were the desperate, ingenious, and often dangerous solutions that ordinary people devised when their world collapsed. From the grapefruit in the backyard to the mop in the closet, Cuban families used technical knowledge and sheer will to find calories where none should exist. They proved that in a true crisis, survival is not about what you have, it's about what you know. The knowledge to turn the inedible into the edible, the waste into the worthwhile. That is a skill that transcends history. If this episode opened your eyes to the forgotten techniques of survival, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which of these desperate foods surprised you the most. Subscribe and ring the bell because next episode, we're diving into another chapter of human resilience that could save your life when everything else fails.